Welcome to Are We the Only Ones? I'm Kathy, and today I'm going to talk about Howard Lutnick talking to Congress and basically having to face the fact that he had lied about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and then admits that he took his family, 4 children with nannies and his wife, to Epstein's Island and had lunch with him after he was already convicted and a registered sex offender. What in the... Can you imagine being his wife right now? Or his kids being like, you took us to that dude's island? I remember that vacation, right? That's going to be the crazy thing is in 10 years' time when we interview their children and go, do you remember going on Epstein's Island? There's going to be a whole series of people that will be able to tell their stories that were children, that will be able to say, oh my God, my dad, we were supposed to be going to a normal family vacation. Next thing you know, we're on St. James Island. Look, Walt Disney Cruises also, Disney Cruise Line had excursions on Little St. James Island because it was apparently a good snorkeling spot. So that was on their excursion list for quite some time. So that's, what that shows is that Jeffrey Epstein has had a very wide reach, right? He had assets that he knew how to monetize on every level to reach every... there were reports that Ghislaine Maxwell at some point was affiliated with Disney in some way, like in casting or something. So that's like, probably with a relationship where Disney and her already had a relationship. She probably introduced Jeffrey to Disney for the St. James excursions. But it's crazy to understand that the consolidation of power was not in the majority for really Christianity and more like the good side of religion, but the actual literal satanic cult, cabal, conspiracy theories that we had been hearing were actually part of that, Trump strategy, which is, you basically accuse your other opponents of the things that you're doing to sort of like throw off the scent from he learned this from Cohen, from his lawyer. I think that was right. So I'm just, okay, all of us are processing a lot of information. It was really crazy to see redacted images of obviously children. It is very uncomfortable to understand the reality of not just our government, but basically every major power broker that really literally controlled the world was affiliated in some way with this cult, essentially. I think what's hard for Democrats and progressives to believe, because we're so empathetic and we're always trying to provide services to help people, is that we aren't necessarily capable of understanding and wrapping our heads around the fact that there is evil out there that exists that truly can be mobilized using certain infrastructures. And if they don't have the infrastructure, they even have enough money to create the infrastructure. So the fact that Jeffrey Epstein was the creator of Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency market makes sense, because obviously that's how they can make transactions for this type of nefarious market. But at the same time, it is for all of us that have been in the structure of, you go to school, you work really hard, you compete in sports, you have to do extracurricular activities, you do clubs, all of this like rated G life. Some of it, sometimes I think, wow, I'm so lucky that I stayed in a certain space where I didn't have to actually be around that. But at the same time, all of us were always sort of led to believe that our entire, almost like meaning of life, is to try to aspire to a level of being one of the greatest, one of the leading people in your industry. And to find out that the intellectual class that you would normally think would be harmless was actually the most harmful class and group out there, it really shakes you to your core because you've been taught a certain sort of like blueprint, right? Roadmap. And you have to now question that. I think one of the greatest things I feel that has come out of this for me is the evaluation of understanding that happiness is not necessarily now about what society has told us it is, which is get that Oscar, get that Emmy, be an A-lister, hobnob, schmooze with the rich. Now it's like, oh, thank God I don't know any crazy people like that because I don't want to be in that world, right? And now we can actually look into ourselves and to the people that we actually know and say, how can I be happy in the world that I'm in now? I am completely restructuring my future plans based on understanding what's really important. And it's helping me evaluate, like one of the things that I think as a parent, for me, that I've been struggling with, my son just turned 12. And we have a structure in the United States, which is totally different than my family would be so confused growing up. I always wanted to leave and not stay until I was married. And I was like, no, like I was conditioned in America to be like, you're not successful in America if you live at home, if you don't leave for college, or at least at the very least after college, you have to launch. Now when I'm looking at the financial structure of the world and, the people that control it and maybe how they think, it is not out of the question to recognize that they create a structure to make us believe that that's important, so that every family now has 4 mortgages, 4 rents, 4 separate cars, a structure where they don't combine all of their wealth into one home to build a family compound. Our American mindset is that you're supposed to break your family up and be separated, and then you have your own units. And then realistically, though, that only helps into the financial sector because now everybody's taking out extra loans. We're paying extra money into interest. Things like that do add up over millions and millions of people. Transactions that just think about all the time that you have to spend trying to get to your family because you've all lived somewhere different now. Like if we were, like for instance, in Vietnam, you basically stay together. We have family compounds there. Asian families, even in cities like Irvine and like developments where they think about Asian families, they will have 2 houses built directly where the backyards are connected, and you can put a fence up or you can open the fence up so that if you have a grandmother, grandfather, and then your family, you can set that up. That's something that Americans think is absolutely like crazy. You wouldn't do that, but why? Why wouldn't you do that? If you think about consolidating all your family wealth, if you get along with your family, you can do this. Consolidate all your family wealth together and able to build a legacy that way. It's actually better. Put everything in. You create family trusts, and you control. Even the banking in a sense where your own family trust could be the bank for your family if you have assets that you put in there, versus borrowing money from the bank that's not able to leverage its assets on behalf of you to make it less expensive for you to borrow money. I'm just looking at things differently now because I don't necessarily want to chase, like you have emails where the CEO of Barclays is telling Jeffrey Epstein that the masses are too busy with the circus and the bread to recognize what's going on. And I felt that before I read that email. I felt that in the air. And I'm guilty of that too. I watch a lot of reality TV. I'm not going to lie. I watch a lot of Bravo. But mainly because I had been a mom, and when you're a mom and you want like non-kid TV, for me the easiest shortcut was like just watch Bravo. That's not, you don't have to really follow the story. It's not like a dramatic arc. You can look at your phone. It was just easy to sort of decompress. And then, but through the last 12 years, I have become addicted to Bravo. I'm not gonna lie. And I have a connection to Bravo because my menswear model was Jax Taylor, and he was on Vanderpump Rules, and I've watched him go through his arc in real life and then on reality hemisphere, and how people perceive and treat him versus who I know him to be. And I also think about, I was talking earlier, I had done a quick recording where I was in my car. Sorry, I apologize to everybody that listened to that recording, and the sound was terrible because I heard it. But I just felt like I had to say it, I had to publish. But basically, I look at Mel Gibson differently now. We still have to kind of relitigate that whole situation. But, I'm looking at like who we've been made to be angry at, and now kind of like reassessing, like, what did they see? Why are they the enemies of these people, right? And, there have been conversations about Michael Jackson in this, because there are conspiracy theories that Michael Jackson, because apparently there was an email where it was like Michael Jackson was, or Macaulay, some kind of conspiracy theory about Michael Jackson being the safer between Jeffrey Epstein and Michael Jackson, which perhaps could be true. But I remember somebody commenting on one of my posts vindicating Michael Jackson. I said, hold on. Whatever Michael Jackson did or did not do or saw required him to take Propofol to fall asleep. Now, I don't know exactly what that man saw or what that man had to wrestle with, but for a human being to have to be anesthetized with surgical, like, I just had surgery and I didn't have Propofol. They just gave me gas. So, like, and I was out. So for him to have to take Propofol, I'm going to assume that he has the worst nightmares because of what he's seen or done, witnessed, whatever, experienced. And that alone tells me he is not completely innocent. So it's a ridiculous statement to think he's completely vindicated. Can we relitigate that and go through things if we have all the information? If the Jackson family is willing to release all of Michael Jackson's communications and we get to see all that and then they get to sort through that? Yeah, totally. I mean, I've been in the presence of Michael Jackson once and I didn't even see his face. It was just because there was a stampede at Universal City Walk in Hollywood because he was there. And I almost got run over. So I know the power. I've been around other celebrities. No one has mobilized power of people that quickly like Michael Jackson. So I think it is fair to, but I believe the guy, I've seen that documentary and I believe Wade Robson. I believe the victims that came forward in the Michael Jackson documentary. So do I also believe that maybe they crossed paths? Yeah, I think it's possible that Michael Jackson, Jeffrey Epstein crossed paths, and maybe Michael Jackson was like, that's not the kind of person I am. I'm not trying to cannibalize or actually hurt them in that way. Which would explain why when you look back at Michael Jackson's interviews when he's like, I would never hurt a child, maybe he's comparing to something he's seen. Because I did believe that he believed that, but I don't think that we had the same definition of what hurting a child was. And now that I'm reading, I'm not downloading the files that are PDFs because it's possible that they're mislabeled and that they're video. And you don't want to have that material on your computer or devices because then you'd be committing a crime, right? Which is also its own web of protection, right? It's like, oh, you don't want to download this stuff. So now I'm also looking at that report about the Pentagon and how they were sharing child sex abuse material all over the government computers. But I'm thinking, well, if they're investigating these crimes, then of course they're going to be on these computers and sharing them because they're investigating crimes. Now, I don't know for sure that's the case, but I was like, well, there is a administrative reason I can understand how that could end up happening. So then there has to be some kind of encrypted, I guess, I don't even know. I think a lot of us are kind of we're just finally getting from the space in society where you can even say the word pedophile and not end a conversation. Where you were the bad guy for just saying the word, just even talking about a story. Now we're in a situation where we're using the word and we're able to talk about this. And that means we're able to research, investigate. But, we also have to take care of our mental health because some of this stuff is very jarring. To hear the descriptions is jarring. I can only imagine if you've ever seen images how jarring it would be. And most definitely, like even redacted video, like it's going to be pretty jarring to see like large men doing horrible things to newborn babies, So these are things that we really have to recognize that like, if we don't actually hold them to account, that it's not so much that they've confessed, but it's more that they're bragging about what they got away with. And we as a society have to ask us, are we willing to let that be the history and the legacy of this Jeffrey Epstein scandal? We have to look back at now the JFK assassination differently. We have to look at all the major conflicts, even all the wars. We have to look at them like, were they a bigger strategy to create wealth for certain people? They could move markets. They just needed a catalyst event so that they could have excuses to move markets, right? Because in the world of finance, when you get into the really, really high levels of money, there's not really like risk in the same sense that we take risks when you like go to a casino, for instance. A lot of times you can hedge your investments so you can make money on the upswing and the downswing. And I learned that in the currency trading market. Non-farm payroll days, you could make money if you hedged currency as it skyrocketed up or it tanked down. It would go both directions. You could just hedge and make money on both sides. So that's just a small part of it. I know that there's got to be other financial tools and ways in the market you can make money. Actually, one of the things that I recently feel like is like that. I don't know where this guy placed this bet, but apparently at the Super Bowl, there was a fan who ran on the field and streaked. That same dude placed a bet on either Polymarket or some other. I think it was he put a $10,000 bet down that somebody would run on the field naked in the Super Bowl. He was the one that ran on the field, and he ended up clearing $340,000 from placing that bet. That to me is not like a wager that's fair because you can actually make it happen. It's like I don't know. But that feels like if you could control the market, right? That's sort of the best way I can explain it from like a lay person level of like, if you can control the market, you can actually place the bet, make the event happen, and then collect the money. And then you literally, there is no wager. There was no loss that you ever risked because you controlled the event. So that to me, I'm like, how can you possibly make that a commodity or I don't know. But I'm not an expert in that field. It's just as for my brain, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. There's no wager, right? But more power to that guy. Like, wow, what a that guy had some freaking foresight, right? Creativity, foresight, that's sort of like creating the cryptocurrency market. Like, you just decided you needed it, you're going to make it happen, and you, out of thin air, made a lot of money out of nothing. And it's backed, and it's somehow legal. So the finance world is crazy in that way. And there are times when I look back, I was offered a job in finance back in the day, and I didn't take it because I had heard somebody on the phone talking to a client apologizing for losing like $10,000 of the money. I was like, oh my God, I do not want to work in a place where I have to worry about doing that. So I bailed out of that career, that life. But now that I see how much those people actually really control, it is something that when we think about the Panama Papers, do you remember the Panama Papers, people? Do you remember it was basically a revelation that all the world's top rich elite people were using tax havens and just making a ton of money and not paying taxes into their home countries, which would provide services like healthcare, national healthcare, mental health services, school, all that stuff was being pulled out because they were evading taxes. And it was a big scandal, but like normal people like us didn't understand because we're too busy just trying to make our rent, make our mortgage, make our, meals for our kids, keep the lights on. And so it was like, well, I don't have the bandwidth to understand what these rich people are moving money in other countries and what that means. But if you connect that with the Epstein stuff, then you recognize, oh, all that extra money was probably used to fund this crazy human trafficking network. And when you understand that, then you understand why it's important to tax the rich so much. Because we've learned that the rich, uber, really beyond crazy rich, trickle-down theory is not, for them, it's tipping. It's not, let me create markets for the good of the masses. Could you imagine if there was a Jeffrey Epstein that was the opposite of him, that like did all that stuff, but for good of humanity, what we could have solved? It's like he masqueraded as that type of person because he was donating $25,000, $100,000 constantly to Harvard research, Ohio State. They got $20,000 payments on a quarterly basis for their OBGYN program. You realize that in research and science and in the intellectual world, they need benefactors. And they don't get them through government grants as easily as I think more us people think, that our taxes are funding these things. Maybe they used to fund them, but somehow, through billionaires not paying taxes, they can't fund this stuff. And so the billionaires get to fund it. But then if it's a direct connect from that billionaire to the school now has to maybe do things for that billionaire or look away or whatever complicated mental gymnastics these people have to make in order to justify taking money to get the programs going. And look, it's easy to say, oh, you shouldn't do that. But if you are at a point where you have no money, no funding, you're about to lose everything, you make deals, right? That's the realization I had, is like, you make deals. And there's very few of us in the world that can afford to walk away from a bad deal and wait for another deal. And so I find myself fortunate that I've had these stories that I used to think of as like regretful stories. People would make me feel so like kind of like stupid. Like, you didn't take that record deal? That's so dumb. You didn't go on a 30-day booking for Steven Spielberg for Memoirs of Vacation. Like, are you crazy? But now I look back and I'm like, dude, did I miss a freaking... I dodged a bullet big time. And I find it a great revelation to know that all of us should be very thrilled that when we do our hustle, that we don't end up in those places. Be grateful that your life is not where you have all this fame and all this money and yet you're still a prisoner, right? That is not it. Even though they try to make us believe that was it, it's not it. And then to find out also that the private prison industrial complex is actually straight up tied to the music industry and the hip hop and rap music industry. And it all makes sense because when I was literally like in the beginning of hip hop, I was like a kid watching like the Grammys, American Music Awards. And I remember when hip hop literally hit the scene and I was like, oh yeah, this is gonna be huge. And I remember like loving Arrested Development. loving Diggable Planets, loving Mos Def, loving Common, loving Talib Kweli. And I now understand that they didn't get the funding they needed because they were funding, record labels were funding gangster rap because it would motivate and inspire kids to do and live that gangster lifestyle, which would then get them arrested, which would then put them in jail, which would then make money for the private prison system. That is the modern Jim Crow, whether you guys realize it or not. That is the modern slavery in America now. And we don't get to tie this stuff together because we're too busy either working or escaping by watching, myself included, reality TV. So I think reality TV as a whole needs to actually look at itself and take responsibility for its role that it's played in distracting all of us from what is real in real life, what is actually important, who we're actually supposed to hold accountable. Howard Lutnick, current Commerce Secretary, was also the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. When 9/11 happened, Cantor Fitzgerald completely was like the number one victim of 9/11. Cantor Fitzgerald was the size, it was such a big company at the World Trade Center that it had its own zip code. Howard Lutnick was the CEO, and he was the only person to survive because he happened to come into work late that day, even though he had never been late to work prior to that. Did he do right by the survivors of Cantor Fitzgerald, the family members, their children? Yes, he did. But I find it interesting that that's who he is, and he is also Jeffrey Epstein's former neighbor. So when he's saying to Congress, "Oh, I barely even knew, I barely talked to him at all," my dude, you're his neighbor, Upper West Side townhouse. I lived in New York for 12 and a half years. I own my own condo, but I was in a building with 7 floors in it, multiple units. These guys were the only owners and residences of their buildings. So for years. So I find it hard to believe, like, oh, I didn't even know the guy. I mean, that's literally your neighbor in a city that doesn't have neighbors set up like that, where you're the only guys that own that building. So when he's being questioned, I don't want to say deposed, but when he's being questioned, he is under oath, and he's saying, "Oh, I didn't really know him at all." And then he goes, "Well, I mean, we did go on vacation and go to his house one time for lunch." I'm like, bro, you left a family vacation that you pre-planned, made new plans, and adjusted to go on a separate trip to this guy's island to have lunch for an hour? I don't think so. The trip alone takes longer than an hour. So, like, even just trying to clock it down like it's not a big deal, it's very suspect. So it opens up a lot of other questions that I'm just going to wait and see if other journalists that, have more resources can understand where to go. But a lot of the things that I have started to recognize and analyze, I see are coming out of the Wall Street Journal, I see coming out of CBS, and I'm like, okay, good. I'm relieved. Thank God. But it hurts me to know that it was not like they only had 30% control. It hurts me to know they had over half of the world's control, and that now we have to somehow fight for the balance back. And can we do that? Can we as Americans do that? The Italians right now are protesting ICE in Italy. I don't know why we have ICE in Italy, but it's making it very difficult for our athletes to compete because it's awkward for them. I think the games is a great way to sort of handle conflict, international conflict, but then do it in a way that's peaceful. So we'll see how that pans out over the games over these next few weeks. And, I'm just glad, I don't know if many of you know this, but when I was in New York, I fought off a kidnapper on the West 4th subway platform. And all of this news of Jeffrey Epstein, the trafficking network, made me realize that I probably saved my son from being put into that network on that day. Because I remember thinking, this woman is good looking. This woman is doing this in broad daylight on the subway, which is very busy in New York City. And it's not easy to get a stroller with a 18-month-old baby out of this subway. Because the West 4th subway has like multiple levels. And I was on, I believe, like the second level, sub-level. So I thought, man, whatever is going on right now, they must be getting paid a lot for it to be worth it for her to risk that. Or it's actually more pervasive than we realize. And then I just sort of went home shaking. And then with my thankful, at that time, privilege, I was able to just go buy a car the next day and just not have to be in the subway again with my baby. But we don't all get to do that, right? Like, that was a very lucky time. There definitely been times where I, like, can barely scrape together, enough for, like, a legit meal back in the day when I was in New York, like. So I know what that's like to be really, really, like, short on cash and not have money. So I remember being like, thank God we can do that, because I had to keep us safe. But, I had to fight off a trafficker, kidnapper, and now I understand how serious and pervasive it is. So everybody out there that's a parent, be vigilant right now. This is bigger than we ever realized. I don't know how we're talking about it to our kids. My kids know that they had to, that I fought off the kidnapper. They're alert about stuff like that. But it is something that is hard to explain to your kids without making them scared. So, let me know. How are you guys dealing with it? I'll share with you what I'm kind of like experiencing with that. And hopefully together we can figure out how to keep our kids safe, how to stay in the right space where we don't touch and get affected by any of this crazy stuff. And hopefully we can get our goodness, the numbers of the good, so large and so active that they have to reassess everything. Tell me what you think. Give me a like, follow, subscribe. I'm going to start probably bringing in Ulta Dispensary. We're going to do maybe like CBD bath bomb spa packages for any founding members and other paid subs. I'll be sending stuff like that. So let me know if you like bath bombs or if you like balms, like to rub, or chapsticks, so I know what to include in these little care packages for you guys. All right, until next time.